Hello and welcome to Dialog ASEAN25. I'm your host, Fana Sheikh. Now, this is the show that talks about the most important challenges and opportunities faced by ASEAN as a bloc and to commemorate Malaysia's chairmanship of ASEAN 2025. And for today's episode, we will be talking about the Code of Conduct to basically establish regional and peace and stability in the South China Sea. And joining with us today is Professor Datuk Dr. Rahmat Mohamad, Professor at the Faculty of Law, UiTM, and Professor Dr. Adam Leong Kok Wei, Director of the Centre for International Defence and Security Studies from UPNM. Thank you so much for joining us, gentlemen. Right. We want to dive straight into the topic, which is the Code of Conduct that was established between China and ASEAN member states to basically establish regional peace and stability with regards to South China Sea. Now, our Prime Minister, Datuk Seri Ibrahim, had called for a conclusion of the Code of Conduct as soon as possible to address and solve disputes in the region. But progress has been slow, or has been gradual but slow. So what is hindering the progress, and what does it take for us to establish peace in the area? Now, let's start with Professor Dr. Rahmat. How much progress has been made so far, and what are some of the biggest hurdles that could still delay the conclusion of the Code of Conduct?
Thank you, Farhana. In terms of progress, you rightly say that it's being very slow. I would say that it's significant since its introduction, and it built on so many issues, and unfortunately, China and ASEAN especially is divided on whether to pursue a full blast code of conduct. A full blast code of conduct would mean that it should be based on a legally binding code. So this is the sticky issue with China. As you know, that China has been trying to avoid the binding nature of the code. So that is why it has been very slow, insignificant, and China has always been giving their options in relation to only when it is binding, and the fact that it should not be with other countries other than ASEAN, and ASEAN would have a divided view on this. So it never come true. And the other thing that is very important as to the code is the geographical area of concern is not really in place, or the zone of applicability, they say, so this is not really being settled in the negotiation. And also, as I said, the uncertainty of it being in a binding nature. So well, you know that there are only 4 members of ASEAN that are involved in the dispute, and it's spreadly. Other ASEAN members are not. And since the declaration of the code was introduced, this has always been the problem. And of course, when it is a declaration, it is only a non-binding declaration. So it is easier for China to come in. But because of later part of it, the second phase of that is to make a binding code. That is really something that China is not willing to proceed, or in other words, China will play its diplomatic acrobat in and giving a lot of excuses. So that is my take at the moment on the status of COC, Farhana.
Right. Okay. So it's quite multifaceted, the problems here. You mentioned, the problem with it being legally binding and China's acceptance of that. But Prof. Adam, if you can chime in here with regards to, now this agreement or this deal is made with the whole bloc with China, so 10 ASEAN member states with China. So some ASEAN members, like Prof. Dr. Rahmat just mentioned just now, it involves only 4 claimant states, and it's a deal made with the whole of ASEAN. But so some ASEAN members are being critiqued to be seen as laggards in negotiations, while China is also accused of shifting goalposts. So how do these dynamics actually affect progress and the possibility of reaching consensus?
Well, Farhana, thank you very much for your question. I think the important thing about ASEAN is the way it does its business, how it makes its decision making by consensus. ASEAN has a consensus decision making process where all members must agree before something can move on. So in this aspect, as you rightly pointed out, there are only 4 ASEAN members who are claimant stakes over the South China Sea. Hence, the other 6 ASEAN members may not have direct interest in South China Sea. For example, Laos, PDR is a landlocked country. Perhaps Myanmar, I think they are more keen on Andaman Sea and Indian Ocean security issues rather than South China Sea. So hence you can see the urgency is not necessary there because some of the ASEAN members do not have interest in South China Sea. And the second point, as also has been pointed out earlier on, China has been playing both bilateral and multilateral contacts with the ASEAN members, in a sense that sometimes China would deal directly with some of the claimant states and other ASEAN members, and sometimes China will work with ASEAN, depending on what is the strategic context at the point in time. And then you must also note that ASEAN members, almost all ASEAN members, I can safely say, their largest trading partner is China. Right? Even the 4 claimant states, the largest trading partner is China, and China is also the largest investment in terms of foreign direct investment for infrastructure project. So in a lot of sense, all the ASEAN members rely on China for their economic prosperity, and hence they tend to track very carefully when they deal with China, especially in relation to South China Sea issue. Hence, you can see because of the consensus decision-making process and the ASEAN members' individual bilateral relationship with China and their national interest, you can see these are the things that is sort of putting ASEAN as a group and ASEAN members individually sort of taking a very cautious, slow approach when they deal with China in relation to the Code of Conduct or COC.
Right. I mean, there needs to be, so you're saying there needs to be, so everyone is playing this delicate balance when it comes to approaching this subject. And the fact that it's consensus based, even though, you know, it's kind of the main thing with ASEAN, that's one of its power that it decides as a bloc, is also a hindrance to solving the disputes in the South China Sea, if that's what I'm getting at here. Right, okay. So when it comes to, you know, establishing peace or regional stability in this region, this is not the first time it's been done. The Code of Conduct is not new. It has been proposed way earlier before, and there has been other mechanisms as well. For example, the 2002 Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea. So with regards to other mechanism that was proposed before and the Code of Conduct that is now, you know, ASEAN states pushing forward, what makes it more what makes COC a more effective framework for managing disputes? Prof. Rahmat, if we can take this.
Thank you. Of course, it is most desirable that the Code of Conduct must be a rule-based mechanism. Yeah, that is very much desired. But, you know, before the declaration of the COC, we have currently what is being applicable in ASEAN, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in 1972. I think this is the foundation of any dispute settlement matters in ASEAN, that ASEAN that time agreed to have this Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. But unfortunately, until today, it has not been utilized. What we have instead is when you have bilateral issues like territorial dispute, then parties would go to ICJ to submit their cases before ICJ. But you should be able to use Treaty of Amity and Cooperation because it is meant for ASEAN. But coming back to what is the best or most effective mechanism, as I said, the most desirable mechanism is rule-based. But unfortunately, ASEAN is not really into rule-based matters. You see, this is also both for ASEAN and China. China is not, in favor. It's not a proponent of rule-based mechanism, and so is ASEAN, because as you can see, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in 1972 is actually, illustrate why ASEAN is not into that. They would rather go into a political or diplomatic solutions in settling the dispute. So it is difficult. But if you ask me, I would like to see the binding nature of the code, uh, and there must be substantial improvement to the code. Maybe listing the unacceptable and acceptable behavior of parties in South China Sea when it deals with dispute. For example, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. Uh, you need a concrete, practical framework for maritime cooperation. We talk about maritime cooperation. Of course, you have to bring in UNCLOS or UN Convention on Law of the Sea. Unfortunately, China had actually it's very costly for China because in 2016, as you know, the tribunal decision was not in favor. Where China refused to be part of that arbitration and they lost the case. But of course, to China, that is not important. They refuse to acknowledge the winning party, Philippines. But still, that is one issue that China is very afraid of. Yeah, they're very cautious when you say you want to make it a dispute settlement. So maybe a quasi judicial mechanism could be in place. I would like to see, for example, conciliatory body. If there is any dispute, any disagreement, a conciliatory body consisting of ASEAN members and China to sit and discuss the importance of this. And because at the end of the day, Farhana, is the issue of enforceability. You may
Right.
have a 100% strong, rule base, but you see that the tribunal decision in 2016 did not make any development because although Philippines wins or won the case, but unfortunately China refused to enforce it. So that is the issue on enforceability of COC.
Right. I mean, you want to talk about the effectiveness of the COC and also the possibility of making it, like you said, legally binding, having an enforcement power. But as you rightly mentioned, there are obstacles when it comes to, how ASEAN approach China, for example, like Prof. Adam mentioned just now, and also how ASEAN has been dealing with agreements. It has mostly been dialogues and talks and negotiations, more so than rule-based, like you mentioned just now. So we want to talk a bit more on that later, but I think we have to address the elephant in the room first, which is the second Trump administration that has been taking a firmer stance when it comes to China's maritime claims in the South China Sea, China's increased activities. We have heard news with regards to tensions in the South China Sea, especially between Philippines and Chinese vessels. So does this, with the Trump second administration actually looking into this and saying out loud that they are against China's increased activities, does this actually increase pressure on China to finalize the COC with ASEAN, or is it likely to complicate the process even further? Prof. Adam?
I believe that the US has been consistently making a lot of statements against Chinese claims in South China Sea, and there's always been promoting the rules-based order where everyone should follow the UNCLOS, United Nations Convention Law of the Sea on UNCLOS, and the US has always been taking action. The US Navy has been doing freedom of naval operations or FUNOPS over the last decade or over the last few decades. So they have been very consistent in terms of the stance vis-a-vis in relation to South China Sea. Whether President Trump would divert from previous administrations, I am not really convinced that Trump would really take a harsher tone against China in relation to the South China Sea. You must see that Trump's priority is to make America great again, and he's talking about tariffs. So that is primarily about building America's economy again. So he's sort of dealing with the trade imbalance with China, not just China, other countries in Europe, you can see in Canada, Mexico also, and he's raising tariffs from 25% to 10% and whatnot. So I think his attention is more focusing into that aspect rather than confronting China in a more aggressive or assertive manner in South China Sea. Secondly, you must also, Farhana, we must also consider that US do not have claims in South China Sea. It is keeping the sea lines of communication open and free for all vessels. So until that becomes a real problem, the US Navy and the US Coast Guard will not come in more aggressive or assertive against Chinese Coast Guard operations in South China Sea and whatnot. And secondly, you can see the problems between Philippines and China, both of them engaging each other, their coast guards and the fishermen militia firing water cannons, loud sounds using or lasers or whatnot. Those happen in Philippines exclusive economic zone, EEZ, and that is international waters. So, and that is not territorial waters. So in relation to Philippines and the Philippines-US defense agreement pact and whatnot, it covers only the Philippines territory, which is the land, and the territory sea, which is only 12 nautical miles. So anything beyond that is international waters. So you can see even the US sort of play a very safe game in this issue in South China Sea because they do not want to accidentally clash with the Chinese, and then things may escalate and turn into a more dangerous conflict that we want now and we are ready for. And then, of course, I would say even if US President Trump and US ramps up their actions against China and South China Sea, the China today in 2025 is not the China in 2002 when the declaration of code of conduct started. 23 years now, China has moved very, very far ahead in terms of technology. They are building their navy, they are building their coast guard. In fact, they are the largest navy in the world today, and they have demonstrated their capabilities and their willpower not to cow down to anybody. Just look about last month ago, the Chinese sank 3 warships into Australia's EEZ, exclusive economic zone, and did live firing exercise. And they remain around that area too. So that shows that now their navy is a blue water navy. They can sail to many parts around the Indo-Pacific, and they can, they have the capability to conduct military operations. So in today's context, China is not the China that was 20 or 30 years ago. The China today is a country that will not be easily coerced by another power, and they will stand up and face differently from how they did maybe 20 or 15 years ago. So we have to be very careful about this and also be cautious about the so-called great power competition between US and China. And this is where ASEAN is pushing for a code of conduct COC. In a sense, it makes it something that is done between ASEAN and China without interference from external powers. And that's why I believe ASEAN understands the risks involved, and that's why they always maintain the line that ASEAN, China COC, right? So they are not including external parties or whatnot into this process. So I think that that's also sum up the how this strategic context between ASEAN, China COC, and possibly the involvement of US in this issue.
Right. I mean, you mentioned how just now, earlier that the US might have their interests elsewhere with regards to some of the measures that they've been pushing for with tariffs, for example. It's more towards their own interests. It's more towards, dealing with their own trade, protecting their people. So, yeah, maybe something that happens quite far away from them might not be, in their priority list at the moment. So there's that that you mentioned just now. Right, okay. Prof. Rahmat, we want to talk about what you mentioned just now, which is, the enforceability of the COC. So what mechanism is being considered actually when it comes to ensuring compliance with the COC? I mean, China has dismissed the 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling last time. What are the chances of China agreeing to a legally binding deal? And will, if it doesn't agree, will the COC merely just be a diplomatic tool without any real enforcement?
It's difficult to say, actually, as regard to I mean, as I said, desirably, the most effective way is to have a rule-based mechanism to ensure that there is transparency, there is, issue of getting these matters, the issue settled. But in a world of diplomacy or international relation, rather, countries do not really use legal as finally an achievement. I mean, you will never get 100 because in a rule-based system or in a system where you have third-party adjudication, is like a zero-sum game. You don't win some, it's not like that. You will lose everything. It's just like the 2016 tribunal, for example. There is no middle path, or parties can agree to that. Of course, we see in Batukuti is a 50-50 thing. So we don't lose everything, but we got Batuan Tengah, Singapore got, for example, but it's very rare situation where when you put an educatory body, you will get that sort of outcome. So what is important is, to me, to have a hybrid mechanism. In other words, of course, you will start off with rule-based. Everything is transparent. Everything is towards leading to a more systematic, more consistent mechanism. But as regard to perhaps as regard to enforceability, then this is really an issue. How do you enforce it? Of course, it is if a state wins a case, there is a bargaining chip for the state. So state would say, well, on the basis of rule-based system, I won. We are, we win. However, we will not proceed on that. Perhaps on further negotiation, something like that. That would be, I would say, a hybrid. You would have a 50, or you would have a mixture of rule-based plus diplomatic or political approach as to resolving the dispute, and parties would be more in a at ease position if that is the case, because it's very difficult for China to accept the fact that they lost the case in 20 states. It's a superpower, Imagine losing to Philippines, So I'm not undermining Philippines, but still, that is the situation basically. And I think what is also important as far as ASEAN is concerned, ASEAN, the misgiving of ASEAN is that it is an intergovernmental organization. It is not like EU, where decision is binding. So here you have a 10 countries organization. They have their own mind. They would, of course, the interest of the state is very important. That will be the priority. So we can understand why some ASEAN countries are not for this kind of code of conduct. And Professor Adam also mentioned there is also a mini multilateral or mini bilateral negotiation being done by China and other ASEAN member states, and it all boils down to economic interest. So it is difficult that way. So I think what can be done is to look at the enforceability of it, and perhaps this is, of course, ASEAN is very unique in the sense that they don't have a rule-based 100%. It does not work out for ASEAN. Maybe China is also like, there is also maybe a cultural thing. This part of the world would have a different kind of approach when it comes to settlement of dispute. So I think that is something that ASEAN and China will have to look into that seriously. As I mentioned, conciliation or conciliatory body, although it is not binding as such, but it is an option given under the Article 31 of the UN Charter, that it is an option for peaceful dispute resolution. So why not? take one of these, mediation, maybe, conciliation, and you have only ASEAN and China. You cannot include others because China has already given take their position that they took their position that if you include others, then forget about this. But at the same time, you must also understand that law of the sea affect what we call mare liberal, freedom of navigation, freedom of the sea. It is difficult for China to constrict or to restrict its movement, or say that others should not interfere, because as you know, it is a very important trade route. And then other countries like Japan, Australia, India are very concerned about all this, especially the security. So I think I will stop there. Farhana,
Right.
maybe we can discuss further.
So, right. So, Prof. Adam, if you could add into that, do you agree with some of the sentiments that Prof. Rahmat just said? So, no external powers, a conciliatory body, and also, having other measures beside the COC itself to de-escalate tensions, or do you think they require any additional measure for COC to be effective?
Okay, I think the key thing is that I can hear the discussions going towards the legally binding and non-binding, right? So from what we know is that China is pushing for a non-binding COC, and ASEAN is hoping to get some sort of binding COC, so that it makes sense that once you have the COC, it should be operationalizable, and everyone should adhere to it. Now, the big issue is that for China is that if it is binding, who is going to enforce it? Is it going to be ASEAN or external powers? So what if someone does not follow the code of conduct? Will you be punished? So imagine that imagine you're from Chinese perspective, from China, right? They are the sort of regional superpower. Are they willing to be punished by the other countries, ASEAN as a whole, or other claimant states? So that become a sort of sticky issue, I believe, that is driving, that is delaying the COC, ASEAN-China COC discussion thus far. And then there are other issues in relation to it. For example, I believe that China also wants to have a say whether military exercises can be done in South China Sea with ASEAN members. That is, if you want to do military exercises with other countries, say Malaysia with Australia, or Malaysia with US, we must get China to agree first before it can be done. So that touches on national sovereignty issues. And I believe that is also holding ASEAN back in some of these key points, whether they will agree or not. And of course, they also touch about oil exploration, oil drilling in South China Sea, and then it must be done by the claimant states itself, and there should be no involvement for external parties, external oil companies, and whatnot. So these are some of the difficult things that I think ASEAN, the claimant states, and ASEAN as a whole, and China would have difficulty to reconcile. We will say these are certain things that cannot be easily mutually agreed for each other benefits. So like Professor Rama has pointed out, it's not a zero-sum game. So it depends on how much the ASEAN claimant states and China is willing to sort of trade off to gain something else and whatnot. So that is I hope how Malaysia as ASEAN chair today, our Prime Minister can negotiate over these difficulties and able to sort of at least have dialogues between between ASEAN and China to come up to have some traction, to continue the dialogue session, the discussion, the negotiations, to come up with ASEAN-China COC that is mutually acceptable by all parties, rather than heading towards a hard line and pushing for something that would be very difficult to be accepted by any parties, and then you're not going to hit anywhere. So that's why you can see it has been 23 years, right? ASEAN-China COC has been going on, I believe, why? Because of the difficult key points that needs to be agreed on. And of course, the problems that if you agree to this, you will lose this. If you lose this, then you have faced problems with your people who is going to question you, your population will question you, why did you do a losing deal, and so on. So because of all these dynamics that's going on between this ASEAN-China COC, I believe this is what is delaying the process. But having said that, it's not like an end game or whatnot. As long as the ASEAN-China COC is still being discussed, that means ASEAN and China are still taking measures, making sure that
Right.
the peaceful,
Right.
sort of peaceful resolution to the South China Sea issue through the COC.
Okay, so you're saying as long as we're not exchanging fires and we're still talking, we're good. Right. That's a very ASEAN way of answering it. But okay, so more talks and more negotiations and looking at trade-offs. But okay, this has been ongoing for quite some time. What can actually push the needle here? Not to say besides talks or besides negotiations, because obviously that will continue, but is there anything you feel that could sort of, any additional measure, additional solutions, unconventional solutions even, that can push the needle forward just a bit more than where it is now? Prof. Rahmat or Prof. Adam, if you feel free to chime in.
Maybe just one point. I think what is been going on now is on the joint cooperation
Right.
among China and some ASEAN state. I think this is a very good initiative to begin with. I mean, it works well, especially with Malaysia and Thailand. And I think there is a suggestion that China should also work on this joint cooperation because it involves definitely issues regarding economic interests, and you know that it has been said that the area South China Sea is covered with oil and gas, and this is something that they can work out. And of course, uh, there is of course this sticky issue, China wanting to have everything because of their historical claims, despite the fact that that is no longer valid as far as the tribunal is concerned. But still, I think this is something that they can work out. I've read somewhere that China is keen to do that. Maybe we can start with that, and then of course, once you have the business going moving, then there is always issue of legal, isn't it? I mean,
Right.
security, and that will come or that will fall in very nicely. So I think that is one initiative that we should encourage.
Right. I mean, I have heard of, analysts or critics on this issue suggesting, for example, joint environmental protection zone or even a neutral maritime area for joint ASEAN-China cooperation, those sort of things. It strays away from, I feel, the sovereignty part of it, which is, yes, at the crux of it, that's the issue, but it provides a new lens to the ongoing conflict that, something that ASEAN members and China can probably explore when it comes to working together and skirting a little bit around the issue rather than, going full head on the sovereignty claims. So yeah, I mean, that's one take. Right. We want to talk about Malaysia's role in all this, because obviously, Malaysia is the chairman of ASEAN 2025. And, over the past years, Malaysia has taken a relatively cautious approach to the South China Sea dispute while balancing its very good relations with China. How does Malaysia's ASEAN chairmanship will impact its role in pushing for a meaningful and enforceable COC, in your opinion? Prof. Adam, we can start with you.
Right. I think there's a strong aspiration by the Malaysian government Malaysia as chairman of ASEAN, hoping to drive this agenda forward, trying to have at least some additional momentum to move towards. Although there are some unofficial targets given, like by 2026, and some say by 2030, perhaps we have the ASEAN-China COC done with. Everyone will agree and the document signed and whatnot. But again, as I mentioned, there will be a lot of hiccups, primarily because of the different aims and objectives of the claimant states have. And of course, China, bear in mind China's interest too. So whether we can come to that middle point would be the most difficult and of course the most interesting part. But having said that, Malaysia has always been very astute in its diplomacy, in its foreign policy, in how it maneuvers itself, how it deals with other countries in Southeast Asia, within ASEAN, and with external powers like China. We have been very successful over the last few decades, putting ASEAN or Southeast Asia right in the center of attention, and managed to avoid external powers coming in, initiating conflicts and whatnot. You can see ASEAN set up in the middle of the Cold War in 1967 after confrontation. From there, right up to the end of Cold War in 1989, 1990, we have been doing very well, keeping external parties out and then managing our own issues together. And Malaysia has always been the forefront. We are one of the pioneer founders of ASEAN, and we have always been driving to keep ASEAN, the region, as neutral, open, and inclusive for everybody. And that have kept us safe all this while. When the Cold War ended, it was Malaysia again, we drive to include more Southeast Asia countries as ASEAN members. So you see after that, Vietnam joining, Cambodia joining, right? So you can see that is a lot to do with Malaysia's initiatives. So I believe our Malaysia today, with our Prime Minister who has long experience in government, in foreign policy and whatnot, we will continue to use our strength, which is diplomacy, negotiation power, to try to get other ASEAN members and China especially to come to a middle point. I'm not sure whether we can get the COC concluded by this year when Malaysia chairs, but at least if we get more traction and more momentum pushing forward, we hope this thing could be concluded, if not this year, maybe next year or the next 5 years perhaps, right? And of course, as a note of caution, almost every country that chair ASEAN, for example, Vietnam, Philippines, the year before they chair ASEAN, they always say we want to have this ASEAN-China Code of Conduct concluded next year or something. But you don't see that happen, right? After the chair, after the year, you can see ASEAN-China COC is still in discussion, right? But as I say, it's good as long as we don't end up fighting each other, right? As long as we are still talking, that's fine. No matter how long it takes, as long as
we're not going at war with each other.
It's better to have no deal yet, rather than a bad deal.
Right. That should be like, underneath the ASEAN logo, that should be the ethos or the motto underneath it. As long as we are not exchanging fires, we're good. Right.
Farhana, I think that relates back to our ASEAN or Southeast Asian culture, how we work together, how we rather prefer to talk, discuss things rather than outright say, all right, you do this thing, I'm going to hit you, right? You're not listening to me, I'm going to hit you. So I think that's the way how we are embedded in our culture, and that actually filters into our way of how we do diplomacy and foreign policy also.
Right. Prof. Rahmat, the same question, but I would like to tweak it a little bit with regards to, today's landscape, right? You mentioned Cold War just now. Analysts and critics are saying that, the South China Sea could be the new Cold War if tensions are not addressed, especially between, when you put in external powers like US with regards to US-China tensions. So with this conflict right now, or tensions right now, geopolitical shifts and all that, how do you see Malaysia's position with regards to pushing this forward? And how would it affect sort of internal cohesion of ASEAN in the long run? Is there a risk that we push this forward? Like you said, deadline 2026, for example. Is there a risk of rushing, or should we take a more, again, slower approach of talks and dialogues? Indonesia last time has taken a few steps with regards to pushing this forward. So is Malaysia is in a good position right now with regards to what's happening around the world to conclude this or to have some sort of success with it?
To begin with, I would like to say that ASEAN has always been dubbed as the most troubled area in the world. At one time, the domino theory, which never happened, that has been promoted by America. And then now they say the Balkan of the East, this part of the world, is going to start the Third World War. So that has always been the play. That has been the scene been placed, the situation in this part of the world. But because of ASEAN, not to say neutrality, but the way we do things, or we call it the ASEAN way of resolving dispute, it does work in that sense. I mean, it managed to stop conflict. We are able to manage conflict among ourselves. Of course, we have the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, and now the COC will be the second phase. I think we must do it by ourselves. What is important to me is to uphold ASEAN centrality. In other words, this discussion or negotiation on COC must be that ASEAN and China, not others, because
Right.
it will have problems in that sense, because we are trying to not to tame China, but at least to have that confidence. Of course, Australia, India, US are not happy with the kind of the way ASEAN is taking their stand is very slow, but that has been ASEAN, and we know for sure that something will work out at the end of the day. Now, the other thing that we must ensure is these four states will not lose their stake at the spread list. This is very important. We can be very friendly to China, but we must make sure that these four states must get their audience. In other words, how do we resolve these territorial issues? And you mentioned about environmental protection. Yes, it is very important. In fact, in the tribunal decided that China had actually caused a lot of environmental degradation in that part of the world. I think this is something that very important. People talk about climate change. People talk about Paris Agreement. Maybe you can take a different stand now. Okay, let's discuss with China. How do we solve this issue on as regard to climate change? I think that is very important. That we must not lose sight. Although countries like India and US and Australia are not happy, they even now have their courts. But still, ASEAN must maintain its stand to say that this is ASEAN matters. So that is my situation, and hopefully Malaysia can convince other ASEAN members to push, even if we cannot get the COC this year. But that does not mean, as Professor Adam said, we need to continue talking. This is very important. The conversation must be carried on by ASEAN, lead by ASEAN.
Right. I mean, I like how you mentioned that, claimant states also need to stand firm, because Malaysia is one of the claimant states as well. And when it comes to our relations with China, for example, I think Prime Minister Datuk Seri Ibrahim has highlighted it quite clearly that although we have good relations with everyone, but we need to stand firm with our principles, our ideals, and our values, and to a certain extent, our territories as well. So I think that's a good way forward. Especially when it comes to the summit that is happening this May, 26 and 27 May, the big ASEAN summit, and hopefully that Prime Minister Datuk Seri Ibrahim can highlight that some of the measures that were mentioned by both Professor Rahmat and Professor Adam. Professor Adam, do you have anything else to add with regards to this as a closing statement?
All right. Just now I wanted to chip in, but now a closing statement, I think I will just chip in now. I think you were talking about joint development, Professor Rahman, about South China Sea. Perhaps this is my closing statement in a sense that there's some light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. Now, we have done some sort of minilateral security cooperation in Straits of Malacca, in which there were high sea robberies, piracy cases. Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia and Singapore, we conducted the Malacca Straits Patrol, which was very successful. We cut down a lot of sea robberies and piracy cases. Perhaps Professor Rama talked about joint development. Perhaps I would want to suggest joint security. In the same format can be applied in South China Sea as a start to socialize China with the other claimant states. Perhaps we can conduct joint Coast Guard patrols between the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and China. This is to build confidence, a sort of confidence building measure, and we can jointly patrol the South China Sea against unwanted, criminal activities, piracy, smuggling, or as you mentioned, environmental disasters. How do you respond if the ships collide with an oil tanker, or a fisherman boat has been sunk by a storm? How do you conduct search and rescue operations? So these are the things that I think we can start in a sense that how we can learn to work together to minimize suspicion, to build confidence on each other. Joint development and joint security. That's true. Two tracks of cooperation we can start working on even before ASEAN COC is concluded. So at least everyone understands where we stand. and then we will have a more open dialogue with each other based on these experiences. So in a sense, I think that should be I would say that we kind of like light at the end of the tunnel on how we can sort of move this agenda forward, apart from the various meetings and dialogues that we go on to discuss to conclude the COC.
Right. I mean, I second that completely. Yes, the COC is a COC and it's a long process. As we have discussed, there are delays and significant challenges to it. But like you mentioned, there are other areas that we can look at, that we can explore to deepen cooperation that can hopefully contribute to concluding the COC as well. So I second that entirely. Right, that's all the time we have. I hope we have provided a very thorough discussion on, where the points of tension is and how to move forward, especially with Malaysia's chairmanship, ASEAN chairmanship this year. Thank you so much, Professor Rahman and Professor Adam, for your input and for your insights. And we hope with the ASEAN summit coming, these issues will be discussed and your points will be taken forward. And I think that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm your host, Fana Sheh. Thank you for watching.